As promised, it would get heated up in episode 2. A wrestling term that we sometimes may or may not use in our ordinary lives. Queen P.R. Brian H. Waters here to give you the second episode of the much anticipated Vince McMahon docuseries. I'm hyped. I know I came in a little slow with that one.
You came in with the heat.
Yeah.
I'm feeling good because this episode was aptly titled Heat because it was all about Vince McMahon's controversies. After he gets a lot of success in the 80s, wrestling is now, super, super popular. Hulk Hogan is super popular. He's gone through his journey. And now the criticism comes because people still don't really understand the wrestling business, and there are still media publications and major networks that still weren't covering wrestling. So should we get into the first kind of key takeaway we took away from this episode? And that is the media.
Yes, the media. And it's always something I don't like when people say the media this, the media that. And yeah, is it because I work in the media? Absolutely. But it's always the people that dictate the media. Right. If the people don't have an appetite for it, the media won't feed it to you. So here we learned that a lot of people wasn't too happy. And I think what we saw was a lot of people just didn't understand wrestling. We saw a lot of vendettas against wrestling. And I always wonder, like, why? You know what I mean? Every time I read a book or every time I listen to a podcast, why was there such a disdain for this beautiful business we call professional wrestling and sports entertainment?
Right. You had one columnist that wrote for the New York Post who particularly wanted to cover wrestling, but not in the best light.
Mm-hmm.
They were gung-ho on attacking the integrity of the business, and he really had it out for Vince McMahon. I have not heard that the name of this journalist. What is his name?
Phil Mushnick?
Yes.
Shoot.
I hadn't heard about him.
Mushnick, I'm sorry.
Yes, I hadn't heard about him to this extent until this documentary and the hit pieces that he was writing. Like, he took any chance, any hint of a scandal that seemed like Vince might have been doing, any wrongdoing, he was there to attack him on it.
It makes you wonder a lot of times, like, what did Vince do to you? But then also, is it because as the more I think about it, we saw this for WWE. We still saw a lot of this stuff around the mid 90s. I don't recall seeing a lot of that for WCW. Now, Queen PR, let's take our media knowledge further. The biggest difference is Ted Turner owned WCW, who also owns CNN. So people are not going to go super hard because that could be a job opportunity. You don't have to touch the wrestling but you can still work at a TBS, a CNN, a TNT. So, but that was one of the biggest things that to really kick it off was, and no doubt about it, Vince didn't do himself any favors with the stuff we're going to talk about, but that was the biggest thing. Is like, man, the media really wanted to come in on him.
Yeah, the ones that did choose to cover really did go in on him, and a lot of the trash TV at the time really took the opportunity to talk about some of these stories about Vince McMahon and him taking advantage of his workers and a lot of other things. The Geraldos of the world, who he ended up suing for talking about him and basically kind of making up lies about him. Do you think that Vince's relationship with the media has gotten any better? Like, in hindsight, like, how do you see the media coverage of Vince McMahon's journey now compared to back then? And what kind of evolved since then?
No, not at all. I don't think it's gotten better. You know how usually sometimes you think, okay, maybe he got this one podcast or what have you that he would go on, right? Like nobody never tries. Like you don't see Vince doing a lot of interviews. You don't see him doing podcasts. And this we're
Right.
talking, let's say 10 years ago. And then even that, obviously now I think it's just worse. But yeah, I don't see his relationship having gotten any better. I think his best relationship, media wise, was with somebody who we didn't see, Dick Ebersol.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
know, as you know, Dick Ebersol was like the president of NBC. Huge reason, Saturday night's main event, which is coming back. But then also they went into business together with the XFL,
They
or
did.
they was working together a lot on that stuff. But yeah, I don't think his relationship with the media got any better, to be honest with you.
Not at all. And you can tell that he wasn't used to being questioned.
Hmm.
And you fans did get a lot of insight from the dirt sheets and
Yeah.
those sort of insular publications. But when it came to like mainstream media, no, it didn't help the business at that time. And Vince doing interviews absolutely didn't help either. I think if he could go back, he probably would have done some of those interviews. I do want to know something about regret and how Vince McMahon in this docu series. One takeaway is that he does not regret anything. And I think it had a lot to do with his traumatic childhood, where it was like, okay, and he said something so sad, and we probably should have mentioned it in the previous episode. We did a part one recap, episode one recap. Check it out. Um, where every time he got beat, like by his stepfather, his kind of mentality was, I'm still breathing, so I made it out. Let me keep moving forward. And that's so heartbreaking to hear that that's what a kid had to reconcile with, but it really gives you a peek into Vince's psyche of how he lived his life. It was on to
Yeah.
the next, on to the next, on to the next. I don't look back. I don't regret what happened because that is how I got here. And now I am still able to use my resilience to keep moving forward. But I'm sure he looks back on a lot of those interviews and is just like, oh my
As
Phil
we're sitting,
Donahue show. Like it was a
woof,
crazy.
yeah. As we're sitting here doing this, it takes me back, and it's almost as if when you watch all the DVDs over the years and all the documentaries over the years, you can kind of start piecing stuff together. If you remember when they did a piece on Andre the Giant,
Mhm.
he talked about certain things in his life happen and he just tunes it out and he lets it go and you don't think back about it. And this part, you could clearly see that Andre's death hurt him
Yeah.
because it felt like felt like they never got to reconcile. He took it personally when Andre showed up on WCW television,
Yeah.
and now it makes sense. Like, well, why don't you look back? Why are you always moving forward? We got that in episodes 1 and 2. Like, oh, so that's the deep rooted issue here.
Mhm. Yep. And you did see that bout of vulnerability at times throughout this entire series, talking about
Hmm.
his son, talking about his father saying he loved him before he died, talking about Andre the Giant, talking about his relationship with Hulk Hogan. You can see that vulnerability there, which I think he was ready to share personally. I think he wanted to do this. I think he wanted to make sure that his story was told. He's
Yeah.
getting older. And back in 2021, yeah, why not? I'm untouchable. I'll share everything.
Also, got to remember we had just came out of a pandemic too.
Right, right. It really did make people kind of cherish life a little differently. So let's go into another key takeaway was his Hulk Hogan.
Mm.
And we all knew that Hulk was gonna be a vital part of this because of their relationship. But he their relationship was very much up and down. They
Hmm.
both talk about it in the episode. He talks about the experience of WrestleMania 3 and Hulkamania and how he always knew that he had to eventually move on from Hulk Hogan. We've read a lot about um, Hulk, but he does have his share of sort of controversies, including the um steroid scandal.
Yeah. You know, the Vince Hogan relationship I always thought was very interesting. And you know, as we sitting here doing this show, you think about those who have been close to Vince, right? Is is John Cena maybe the only one who never had like a riff?
Mm,
Hear me out, right? You think about Hogan. Hogan left, go to WCW. That's the part there. And then obviously the steroid stuff, but it was like, dude, you said you wouldn't compete
right.
and you did it. Bret Hart, that goes without saying.
Yeah.
Shawn Michaels, well, as they was ready to transition to business, Shawn Michaels just wasn't in a good headspace. Like he even admitted.
Right.
And then you think about Stone Cold, Austin walks out. And then even The Rock goes to Hollywood. And it might not have been as jaded as far as his top guys, you know what I mean? But it felt like John Cena was the only person who was like, you know,
Mhm.
but you know, the Hogan Vince relationship, what all it did prove, like you know, I love the teaser when he goes, I knew exactly what I was going to say. And I think there's that little bit of like, there's always going to be some sort of loyalty.
Right.
I remember in 2010 or 2011 when Hogan was in TNA, everybody was like, you know, did Hogan really go over there to sabotage this for Vince? That was a conversation amongst some people at IWC because they always like this, that. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
and I was expecting perhaps if there was a hit piece, him to hit us with some more haymakers that wasn't, and he didn't. I think that may have been a surprise that he kept. I, the two words don't sound right what I'm about to say, but for the sake of this, he kept it honest. Hogan kept it honest as far
Yeah.
as his what he felt about Vince.
Yeah. I don't think he, for once, he didn't try to like go on one extreme or the other. Like he didn't
Mhm.
try to paint Vince as a perfect man. He didn't try to paint Vince as an angel. He was critical when he needed to be critical. I do
Yeah,
think this is probably one of the most honest Hulk Hogan interviews. And I
that
think
might
it
be the
had to
biggest
feel
takeaway.
that's the biggest takeaway. And I just know it had to feel good on his part as well
Mhm.
to just be like, this is what my relationship with Vince McMahon was all these years. Period. And we'll get into more of how Vince's relationship with Hogan sort of evolves into many different areas. Um, so this episode Heat, I do think was all about scandal for sure.
Yeah.
So let's talk about another key takeaway is just the numerous scandals that felt like they just came right after the other. The steroid trial, of course, right when Vince was trying to start the WBF. That man love him some physique. He said, "Yo, I'm going to make another promotion to showcase big, muscular, meaty men because I just can't get enough." But
Mhm.
then the steroid trials come, and he is painted as sort of the villain. And this doc does do an interesting job of painting him as innocent in a way that I've never sort of had that
Yeah.
perspective, because steroids was legal at one point, and Vince wasn't telling his guys to take steroids or selling steroids to them. Did he say you need to look your best? Yes. Did wrestlers take that and run with it? Yes. Were people using steroids before Vince? Yes. So how did you come away from them talking about the steroid trial this time around than before, and like Hulk lying and him telling him to tell the truth and Vince even admitting he used steroids? Like, what was your thoughts on that?
It was very interesting but straightforward. You know, we watched a lot of Dark Side of the Ring, and again, you said it best. They painted Vince like, oh, this big monster, and he made his employees go do something that wasn't healthy for them. But you know, I go back to Hogan's book, and I remember when he said Vince got mad at me because he told me to tell the truth. And my mindset is I'm protecting the business. Goes back to one of the things from episode one. But Vince said it. He's like, look. just tell the truth. You took them, you move forward. And I think like
Yes.
that happened in baseball. There was a couple of people in baseball who didn't who did steroids, admitted it, and then it was like, okay, so it's always the truth factor. So that was the thing, and I look back at that part with that scandal. I'm like, man, it wasn't as bad. But what's crazy is we was coming off a couple other scandals. The Ring Boys, which was you don't see covered as much. Uh,
Anymore, because it
yeah,
was
yeah,
like it's almost like so many things have happened since then.
yeah. The snooker scandal,
Hmm.
which was oof.
Yeah, the Ring Boy scandal is one that they tried to sort of cover up almost, and like having Pat Patterson resign and all of that. But either way, sketchy shit was happening, and it all sort of came up at the same time.
Hmm.
That the Rita Chatterhorn
Yeah,
allegations, which is unfortunate because how cool was it that there was a female ref at that time
yeah,
and that era? And then to learn, like, she was allegedly taken advantage of and harassed and all that, it fucking sucks. Um, we're learning about hearing more about that, and also you mentioned it before of how Vince had to be reminded of some of these scandals.
hmm,
He did address the Rita one, denying it, of course, but he hadn't really talked about that publicly a lot. So he ended up settling that case, but he did acknowledge it. And she was portrayed as sort of the villain in that story of someone that wanted to take
yeah.
advantage of this rich man.
She was, and I think we was watching something together, or maybe listening to a podcast where she talked about she saw him at Owen's funeral,
Mm.
or maybe it was Andre the Giant's funeral, somebody's funeral, and it was just barely, barely talked to her, or he said something, and she was like, it was very awkward, and
Mm.
I think the biggest thing that sucked about that was how long it took us to get a woman in the referee
Right
office. Yeah,
after that,
yeah.
right. You are absolutely right about that. But I do want to um shout out the victims that were able to come forward
Mhm.
during this time. And even though it wasn't covered the way that it should have been covered, and Rita being villainized, I'm glad that they had their voices heard.
Yes.
And even in this docu-series, they don't shy away from
Mm.
implicating Vince or saying allegedly, but there's proof. There's this, there's that. I'm sure there's a lot of other women and people that feel like they were victimized by Vince McMahon or when they were working for the WWF. But let's talk about the union,
Talk about it.
because we hear a lot of that from the court cases, from what's his name, that
Jesse Ventura.
yeah, Jesse Ventura, who wanted to start it, and a lot of the wrestlers. But this is the first time Vince really talked a lot about it. And how did you feel about how he addressed that union? He was like, yeah, okay.
When you really think about it, we really got so much Vince McMahon content more than we ever before.
Right.
But like situations like this where he goes, huh, huh, the boys wasn't gonna get behind Jesse. Yeah, okay. You know what I mean? And it was just like nonchalant. Again, Hogan being truthful. He's like, look, I was tied to Vince. That was my guy. So of course I went and
Right.
told. He could have easily said he didn't. And we
Nah,
would have
and everybody was like,
expected.
he snatched.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like one of those things where if you doing most of the work, you don't want to make what everybody else making. That's
Right.
the part people don't think about. Like, of course Hogan wasn't gonna go
Very
for a union.
selfish.
Guess what? In today's world, you think Roman Reigns would go for a union? If we being honest,
Hell no.
right? Um, it's like I put in this work. I'm doing the heavy lifting. No,
Hmm.
we're gonna roll. So but I do love the fact that we got to see that side of Vince where he's like, "Psh, yeah, Jesse couldn't have get the guys. And I'm glad they brought it up. Like, hey, there's people had their livelihoods on the line. They wasn't
Yeah,
snitching or
they
showing
wasn't.
up to
And
that
once
meeting.
Vince pulled everyone into his office and said, if you show up to that meeting, you will not have a job. And guess what? Nobody showed up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's take this time to talk about one of a notable talking head, and that's Tony Atlas.
Yeah.
And we kind of joked about him being in this documentary compared to like a lot of other people that have worked for him, because you
Mm-hmm.
don't really think about Tony Atlas as being someone that was like necessarily close to Vince or pro Vince in the news or something like that. And I do feel like it was for diversity.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't a lot of people of color that was able to talk, or I guess was close enough to Vince to talk about him in this way.
Yeah.
But Tony Atlas is a good interview. He's been on Dark Side of the Ring and has done too many shoot interviews. I know too much about this man. But how did you feel about Tony Atlas being in it and some of the other talking heads that shared their thoughts on Vince?
I liked it because he's probably the one of few, if not the only, at least probably the only one still in their right mind, with all due respect,
Mm,
black men that go back that far.
mm,
Just think about Legends
sure.
House. Him, I think it's just him and Hacksaw Jim Duggan that's like still alive. Piper's gone, Okerlund's gone, Pat Patterson's gone, Finkel's gone. Oh, Jimmy Hart's still here. But we got to see him in this, and so I think it was great. I think High Key, one of the MVPs of the doc.
Hmm.
It's always that. All right, let's go back to the OJ Simpson doc, right?
Hmm.
Like Carl Douglas is the one you always like. He was like the Tony Atlas of this. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Tony Atlas was like the Carl Douglas, like to remember the lines and everything. So I was happy to get to hear his voice, because a lot of times you hear about the jokes, the feet jokes online and everything. Kind of becomes the butt of a lot of jokes. You know what I mean?
Yes, he
And
does.
even in dark shoot, what's the name of that show we love? Young Rock.
Yes.
He's kind of like, I don't want to say the troublemaker, but kind of like, him and Rocky Johnson always on the same page.
Hmm.
So I was glad he really got to shine bright in this.
Yeah. Same. Same. I think him and his family talking about him and their relationships and stuff was also really cool, and like some of the behind the scenes of Vince's personal life I think was really awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, part one was really good into setting up his background and his childhood, and sort of the beginnings of his success and building the brand that he built. Part two was kind of like, all right, I see you. You're successful, Vince McMahon, but now, boom, 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 we're gonna throw all of this stuff at you, and you're gonna get heat. Do you think it was a good follow up to episode two? Do you think they did a good job of covering all the scandal that surrounded Vince McMahon up until this point?
Oh, I think they did a good job, especially just a couple of things like, going from the WrestleMania 1, right? And then into like the WrestleMania 2, but then kind of jumping forth to
Mhm.
WrestleMania 7 with the heat there. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Just showing the terminology, like the world now will understand the word heat.
Yeah.
So I think they did a great job of addressing it, because that's the thing. It's like we've been hearing all these stories. Like I said, we listen to so many podcasts, we watch so many shooting reviews, and it's all right there. Now it's like, let's bring this all to the.
He did a very good job of covering the variety of scandals that he was involved in, how he responded to them, how the media reported on it, how it affected the business, his relationship with Hulk Hogan, the beginnings of the cracks there,
Mm-hmm.
and what was next for Mr. McMahon now, with him having survived all of these scandals. And he was the perfect lead-in for the next episode, Screwjob, which really shows the lengths that Mr. McMahon will go to protect the success of his business.